Minutes to 8. Felix Moore, the nephew of our guest editor Charles Moore, has Asperger's and is transgender. He was born a girl but lives now as a man. He's interested in the way that gender or perceived gender affects the experiences of autistic young people. How are autistic young women treated differently to young men? And how does that affect the support that they receive? He's in his early 20s. He's an actor. When I talked to him, we began with being on the autistic spectrum, its impact on him and on his life.
Well, that's a bit like asking me how much is being you a part of your daily life.
Yes.
It affects every facet of my personality and existence, so it's quite difficult to say. I have no idea what my life would be like if I wasn't autistic.
But how is your life different because you are?
Well, I communicate with people differently than other people. I experience the world differently. Things that seem manifestly obvious to me seem completely opaque to other people and the other way around. You know, when you run a sentence through Google Translate into a different language, and then you translate it back into English and the grammar is slightly wrong and all of the words are just a little bit off. That's what most conversations feel like for me.
Do you try to hide it?
Yes. Well, I figured out I was autistic when I was 9 and I started trying to hide it. Just before I started secondary school, actually, the summer before I started secondary school, I made a concerted effort. I sat down and I told myself I'm going to start over and I'm going to be exactly like everybody else. And then I think I asked a friend to sort of tutor me. From my first day, I was watching everyone around me and I was copying them. And ever since then, I have done it instinctively.
With what effect?
I have spent so much time building up this sort of shell and this persona that comes across to the world that it's sometimes extremely difficult for me to communicate my real needs. Like when I'm at the doctor's, for example, and I can't take in information that's just given to me if it's not being written down or if it's been given in sort of a stream. I can't take that in, but I automatically put on this face that people see as like, oh, he's completely listening. Yeah. He understands everything.
Do you have a particular insight into autism because you were born female but are now male, that difference in the way that autism is perceived in and perhaps affects boys and girls differently?
Yes, I think that difference is pretty striking. And I think that if I had been born male and if I'd been raised as a boy, I probably wouldn't have, to the extent that I did, suppressed and hidden my autistic behaviours.
Why is that?
Because girls from a very young age are pressured and taught to make themselves amenable and polite and smile and make eye contact. And they aren't given the same sort of leeway as boys are in terms of what might be termed antisocial behaviour. How
do the two, the autism and trans issues, fit together?
There's no actual data on this because unfortunately they're both under-researched. But just from sort of on my observation, seems to be quite a big overlap between trans people and autistic people. A lot of trans people are autistic, a lot of autistic people are trans, whichever way you want to look at it. I think in a broad sense, if you live your life knowing yourself to be different, then it makes you more introspective about yourself, makes you more open to seeing yourself differently.
When you thought about your body at that stage when you hadn't made the change, what was it about it? What was it about you, actually? Never mind just your body, but about you, that you felt this change needed to be made for?
I think people tend to imagine that I transitioned because I wanted to be a man or because being a man was something that particularly appealed to me. And it wasn't, and it doesn't. I don't particularly like men as a whole. I think men as a whole have done a lot of pretty unpleasant things. I never had any particular aspiration to be a man. I just knew that I was, and I felt quite conflicted about that. I didn't particularly want to be, but it was just something that I had to do.
Are we getting better at understanding it and supporting it when it happens?
In some ways more tolerant, but in a lot of other ways treating trans people as kind of the latest great moral crisis, in much the same way that gay people were treated as a huge moral crisis in the 80s and 90s. In fact, in exactly the same way.
I find it really striking that we're having this conversation because you are on Charles Moore, your uncle's programme.
Yes.
And he has invited you to be here.
Yeah, well, I was a little bit, I was quite surprised, to be honest.
Why?
Well, because although he is, you know, my uncle, we have, I think it's safe to say, extremely different political views. To be honest, we very rarely talk about politics.
But you get on.
Yeah.
And he obviously respects you enough and what you want to say enough to have you on his programme.
Yes, apparently so.
Because he said in the past, adult transgender mutilation is, of course, a free choice, but why should we be invited to celebrate it? He has his own view, not of you as a person, but of the way in which trans people are treated. And I think his view is that actually we are a little over-obsessed as a society with all of these things.
I hadn't heard that particular quote.
What do you think of it?
I think it's an appalling thing to say. I think it's a kind of language that people use to describe something that actually saved my life.
The thing is, he said that in the past, and the fact that he has brought you on suggests, doesn't it, that individuals, that societies are capable of changing their minds. It's a thing to be celebrated, isn't it?
Yes, I think that people are capable of treating individual family members differently than they are willing to treat populations as a whole.
That's a fascinating point, isn't it?
Yes.
Actually, when you meet someone in your family, it was so much has been said, and I know people who said that about gay people in families. As soon as it becomes something that you can address in a family, that you're aware of in a family, suddenly all those prejudices go. It's interesting, isn't it?
Well, it's not as though he's turning around and suddenly writing in favour of more funding for gender identity services.
Well, he might be soon.
He might be. I would be surprised. I do think it's interesting that he, on the one hand, could say that and then email me before I had that, what he would call adult transgender mutilation, to wish me good luck, which he did.
Which is quite telling, isn't it? It's exactly the point you make about when something happens in a family, you feel differently about it.
Yes, or you're willing to look past it, is the impression that I've got.
Felix Moore, it's a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.